Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. On behalf of the NPS Alumni Association Foundation, I would like to welcome you to this presentation. My name is Rich Patterson, and I serve as the CEO of the NPS Alumni Association Foundation. Our organization exists for the purpose of supporting research facilities, and the alumni, student, and faculty communities at NPS. Our presentation today will focus on the war for autonomy. We're privileged to have Paul Scharre and Dr. Ray Buettner as our speakers. Out of courtesy to our audience, we'd ask you to keep your mic on mute during the presentation. We also recommend setting your screen to speaker view. If you'd like to offer a question, please send it to us via the chat feature, as we'll be monitoring it during the presentation. Now I'd like to introduce our moderator. It's my pleasure to introduce your moderator for today, Todd Lyons. Todd currently serves as the Vice President for the NPS Alumni Association Foundation and is a volunteer instructor for innovation leadership at the Naval Postgraduate School. In these roles, he bridges the gap between industry, academia, and DoD entities to accelerate the responsiveness of NPS to the challenges arising from great power competition and emerging technology. Todd retired last year after 30 years in the Marine Corps and served as the Senior Marine Representative and the Associate Dean of Research at NPS in his final assignment. Over to you, Todd.
Rich, thank you so much for the kind introduction. We're really glad to have everyone with us today to talk about Autonomy, Army of None, the book by Paul Scharre, and really where are we going in the future. Paul Scharre is a senior fellow and director of technology and national security program at the Center for New American Security. He is an award-winning author of The Army of None, Autonomous Weapons, and the Future of War. He had incredible service both at the OSD level and perhaps more importantly at the Ranger Battalion, 3rd Ranger Battalion with tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, and is an honor graduate of the 75th Ranger Regiment's Ranger Indoctrination Program. It is our honor to invite Paul Scharre to speak to us today. Paul?
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me. Thanks everyone for joining today for this discussion. I'm really excited to be here and glad we could be able to do this, even in the current environment. We can connect virtually and have a hopefully robust and interesting discussion. So, let me start a little bit with, I think the fact that we're talking about this through the NPS Alumni Association Foundation is no surprise. NPS has been really central to a lot of these issues about autonomy in a whole variety of ways. As we see autonomy maturing across the U.S. forces in a whole variety of domains, it raises interesting problems operationally. How do we employ these? How do we integrate autonomous systems into our forces? How do we balance what are the tasks that we want machines to do versus what we want humans to do? It's going to be different in different domains, whether you're operating undersea or in the air or on land or on the maritime surface environment. And then, of course, autonomy raises interesting legal and ethical and policy challenges in a variety of ways. And NPS has also played an interesting and important role in dealing with all of those challenges. So I just want to acknowledge that right up front. It is for those who've had a chance to take a look at my book, Army of None, you see that I opened the book in the first chapter with a scene at NPS out at Camp Roberts, where the NPS team is testing their live action demonstration of swarm on swarm aerial dogfighting, which I found was just super cool. One of the really coolest things for me, the most fun part of working on this book was being able to travel around the country and see things and put hands on things that people were developing in the U.S. military, in research labs with greater autonomy. And this was really just one of the most interesting and visceral examples where, for one, people are doing really at NPS and other places cool things in modeling and simulation. But the fact that people were putting stuff up in the sky and seeing it maneuver was really neat. And I want to start with an anecdote from that experience that I just thought really, struck home to me. This particular issue where out at Camp Roberts, I'm watching them do this demonstration. They get these swarms up in the air, and there's 10 swarms on one side and 10 on the other, red and blue. And there's a command trailer, and there's 2 swarm commanders, or humans, sitting at these laptops, and they got the swarms up and ready, and they're looking outside. Is it ready to go? It's ready. All right, go. So there's a countdown, there's a referee as they do the demonstration, counts down to 0. And when they say go, each of the humans just pushes enter on the keyboard. And that's it. That's all they had to do. And everything else was totally autonomous. And all of the maneuvering, now they weren't actually shooting, right? That part was simulated, but real flying, real maneuvering, all done autonomously. And at the time, relatively simple still algorithms. They're just trying to kind of prove the concept. But we've certainly seen over time, things like what are the algorithms that are behind disarming behavior is already maturing. And I think is going to be, an increasing component of how we think about warfare. So we've already seen over the last several decades, the value of military systems shifting from, iron and steel, which is really how the U.S. and allies won World War II by outproducing the Axis powers, to more digital types of capabilities. Right? What makes a Joint Strike Fighter valuable? It's not physically more significantly maneuverable or has better physical characteristics than fourth-gen aircraft. In some cases, it's less capable in some ways, but digitally, it's really the top of the line, world's most advanced digital fighter aircraft in things like sensor fusion and data management. And we're seeing increasingly, the important capabilities in warfare shift into the digital domain in sensors, EW, networking, information processing. And as we begin to layer on top of that an artificial intelligence revolution, we're then layering cognitive abilities onto these digital systems. So the ability to now use machines to process that information, to help better understand it, to present information for decision makers. And one of the central challenges that the military, the United States and other countries are going to be grappling with is not only how do you do that effectively, but how do you do that effectively in a human-machine teaming paradigm, which is the way that the DoD has really shifted over the last 10 years from talking about this issue. I think that's very much the right direction, the right way to talk about it. If you go back to like the mid-2000s, people were talking about unmanned kind of systems, and then that term fell out of favor as people, I think, rightly criticized that, saying, well, look, there are people involved here, right? It's not just these shrodes or aircraft kind of operating on their own. There are people, and even as you incorporate more autonomy into these systems, there's still people behind them. An Army lieutenant colonel told me once, and this really stuck with me. I thought this was a really great way of characterizing it, that we want machines to accomplish tasks, but humans are going to accomplish missions. I think that's a great way of framing it. And so how do we think about pairing humans and machines together? And I'll just observe that we've been doing this for a very long time in the physical domain, in physical pairing, right? So you cannot fight in the air or undersea or very effectively on the surface of water, outside of a very narrow domain like maybe water polo, without having machines at your disposal, right? And we've used machines in some cases like maritime surface warfare, right, for centuries or longer, right? And so we have deep pairing between humans and machines now. And in many domains, that's central to how we fight. What makes that effective is that we have very good intuitions for machines. And in fact, I would argue most of us in our daily lives have very strong intuitions for industrial era machines, right? So, you don't have to be a pilot or a submariner or a surface warfare officer to have these intuitions. You get in your car and, you see the check engine light on, and you might say to yourself, I need to maybe take my car in the next week or so, see what's going on. I'm not sure what's going on there, right? If you see the gas light on, you know that if you wait a week, you're going to have some trouble, right? And you don't need to be a mechanical engineer to know that stuff. And so we've built up an intuition for how to use these systems, and to some degree for using even simple computer systems. I could tell you, I think most of us know that like computer's doing something weird. Maybe you just close the application and reboot it or restart the computer. And for some reason that I could not totally explain to you, that works, right? And what we're dealing with now is more advanced autonomous systems and artificial intelligence, and including machine learning that we've seen exploding in the last 8 years, that we're going to have to develop our own intuition for, because these systems think differently, they operate differently. And that's both a challenge and a tremendous opportunity for the US military to find ways to grab a hold of this technology and use it. So, I just wanted to offer some thoughts there in the beginning to frame how I'm thinking about this technology and its potential and how we might want to embrace it. We could certainly talk in the Q&A about things like autonomous weapons, which is the topic of my book. What happens when a drone has as much autonomy as a self-driving car? Those raise some really interesting kind of challenges because we already have weaponized robotic systems today. The science fiction story of machines someday rising up and turning on us is like more intelligent machines are being born with a gun in their hands. So it's a different actually world that we're living in today, and it poses its own challenges. But we can certainly dive into that in the Q&A if folks are interested. Thanks again for having me, and I'm really excited for this discussion. Thanks.
Hey, Paul, thank you so much for those initial words. In your discussion and in your book, you've highlighted some of the challenges of adopting autonomy in the military context. At the same time, autonomy is being adopted and used really rapidly by a lot of state actors. Are you more worried about the U.S. falling behind, or that we're going to adopt it quickly and badly with all of the risks that might entail?
Both? Can I say both? I mean, I think I see examples of both things happening. I think they're both risky, right? So let me give you briefly a couple historical examples. So one is that I see lots of areas where I don't think we're pushing the pedal down hard enough on the accelerator, and we could do more. And that could be because of a whole variety of reasons. There are many obstacles. Things like legacy programs and platforms get priority in the budget. So anything new fights an uphill battle. That's one challenge. I think another challenge is militaries tend to be conservative out of adopting new technology. I think they get a bad rap for this. I think it exists for a really good reason. So when I was trained as a young infantry soldier, I was trained in near ambush tactics, how to survive a near ambush. The people training me had never been in a near ambush. They'd never experienced that, right? So those were tactics that had been passed down in writing, but also by word of mouth and training from soldiers who learned the hard way in Vietnam, from the few people that had survived, these ambushes and then lived to tell about it and said, well, here's what we did. And so that constancy and conservatism is really important when you're training people for a task where you don't necessarily get that real world feedback all the time, right? And you might go a whole generation or several generations of people training and passing along knowledge before you actually get, that kind of really intense combat experience. So I think that's part of it. I think there are other places where, there are cultural issues that come to bear when it comes to autonomy in particular, that people don't want to hand over, the job to machines. I think that can come up in a variety of domains. Pilots get beat up here a lot, not for nothing here, but they're not the only ones. In some ways, it's just that the machines have come for pilots' jobs first because it's easier in the air domain, and they're coming for like everybody else and it's not that this is the key thing, right? It's not that humans are going to go away or that we don't need warfighters on the edge in combat. It's that how people fight is changing. And in many cases, what we do, and we do this for good reason, but I think it has a hindrance too. We tie people's identity to a particular method of fighting, particular way of fighting. So I will observe, and these identities are very sticky sometimes. I will observe that we have people in the Navy we call sailors. They don't climb the mast and work the rigging of sails. We haven't done that in a really, really long time, right? But that identity is so powerful that even when we went to steam-powered ships and we got rid of the sails, we're still sailors, right? Same way, we got pilots sitting in trailers and they're still pilots and they're wearing flight suits, but it's not just pilots. It's across the board. We got people in the Army we call cavalry. They haven't known anybody who knew anybody who rode a horse, right? And yet that identity is very sticky. So that, I think, it's good to have esprit de corps. Those things are valuable. Where it's a challenge is when it's tied to how we perform a job and rather than accomplishing the mission, right? We need to be flexible in the tasks for how do we perform the mission. So I think those are all kind of challenges, but I also see examples where, we've made missteps and gone too fast. I'll highlight very quickly two ones that are top of mind to me. One is the 2003 Patriot fratricides, where we had Army operators operating a very complex weapon system they did not fully understand, resulting in not only two very unfortunate accidents where pilots lost their lives, but also it resulted in effectively taking the Patriot air missile defense system offline after the second fracture site, right? Where it was the command authority was taken to such a high level, it was effectively rendered useless. Now, in that conflict, that was okay because we had such a massive overmatch against Saddam's military. You can imagine other situations where that level of mistrust of us all of a sudden saying we don't trust this system could really have very catastrophic effects. So I think that's problematic. The other place I'd point to is the cyber domain, where we have totally, for good reason, embraced computers and networks, but we've also adopted all of their vulnerabilities that are hugely vulnerable. And now we're scrambling to catch up. And I'd like to see us learn from those lessons. And when we adopt AI and autonomous systems, do a better job to bake in robustness and security from the get-go, because we operate in a very challenging environment. It's hard to do, but that's the frame of mind that I take, as I'd say, let's go full speed ahead, but let's do so with robustness and security in mind.
Paul, that's fantastic. Thank you so much. We're now going to invite Dr. Ray Buettner to speak to us for a few minutes and kind of add a different layer to this conversation. Dr. Buettner joined the NPS faculty as a military instructor in 1999. His work led to proposing and executing the creation of the Consortium for Robotics and Unmanned Systems Education and Research, also known as CRUISER. And recently, having passed on the lead for CRUISER, Ray has now launched the Sea, Land, Air Military Research Initiative. And this NPS Foundation supported endeavor is developing an interdisciplinary research facility, unique business practices, and revolution military network utilization in support of decision makers that will enable NPS to remain an innovative leader in addressing contemporary military challenges. I would note that Ray is one of the few personages that I know that has been both a student, a MILFAC, and is now a tenured professor at NPS. And so with that, Ray? I believe you're on mute, Ray.
Unmute myself. There we go. Thank you, Todd. And thanks to the foundation for hosting these types of activities for our students, faculty, and the many supporters we have out there in the community. It's really an honor to follow Paul. He's such a talented thinker and writer, and he's really performed an important service both within the government and out in the community with his book and helping people start to wrestle with the many changes that are happening with the military. And to a large degree, these are changes happening across society. The nature of the military mission adds a little different emphasis, especially around things like lethality. But as he pointed out, the actual identity of warriors or bus drivers or factory workers, all of these things are under challenge right now. The technological determinism, are the machines changing us or are we changing them? Is always an interesting issue. And of course, the real answer is both, right? We are being forced to change and the machines are changing in response to our evolving needs. So I'll talk for a little bit about some of the work that's happening here at the school that my colleagues are up to that relate to some of the areas that Paul's talking about, and a little introduction to the Sea, Land, Air Military Research Initiative that you mentioned there that I like to call Slammer. Mainly, I get to tell a wife I'm going to the Slammer for the day. It makes me feel good. So a quick disclaimer before we get going, since I still am an NPS professor and a federal employee, everything I'm going to share today is my personal opinion. It does not represent or should be construed as an official statement for the Naval Postgraduate School, the Department of the Navy, the Department of Defense, or the United States government. All right. So building on Paul's comments, let's talk a little bit about what we're doing here at the school to help prepare future leaders to deal with this world that Paul is trying to help make us aware of. Some of you may have heard, and if you've been reading the news of the day, the Chinese have made our autonomy and artificial intelligence a national priority. And our leadership has recognized this. It's one of the few bipartisan things that's going on right now, is the Congress and the country has recognized that this is a serious issue and we need to act as a whole of country response to that. In fact, we had heard that before here at the Naval Postgraduate School, because we got a wake-up call from former Secretary of the Navy, Richard V. Spencer, who came out and talked about the employment of the Chinese doing things like flying 40 drone systems and deploying undersea, surface, and aerial systems, full up exercises in the field. He believed that, like the Sputnik, this requires a whole of country approach. And he charged the Naval Postgraduate School with trying to figure out how are we going to deal with some of those things. Now, I'd like to think he did that because he knew a little bit of our history. So as Paul pointed out, the school has a long history of working in this area. In fact, in 2012, then Undersecretary of the Navy, Robert O. Work, helped us launch that consortium for robotic and unmanned systems education and research. And the idea there was these machines and the things that we will need to do to operate them are going to change very fast. And we don't want the Navy falling behind. We certainly don't want the Navy's educational institution falling behind. So he worked with us to establish a community of interest that gets an annual approximately $4 million a year to support research on campus and to support our students in going after the challenges associated with autonomous systems. More than 40% of the cruiser community of interest, which numbers over 3,000 people, are industry people. Because again, the Naval Postgraduate School, kind of unique in the Navy, actually operates at the intersection of industry and government and academia. So I'm a professor, a federal employee, and I can go talk to industry because I'm not buying anything or selling anything, right? So he recognized that. Mr. Work wanted us to keep on track, helped us set up Cruiser. And Cruiser built on existing talents here as well. The school has a long history of field experimentation where we work with industry to identify emerging technologies. So Cruiser latches into that. The Center for Autonomous Vehicle Research in our Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering Department, world leaders in drones and autonomy work, underwater as well as aerial systems. The aerial systems are easier to see and we talk about them a lot, but there are some serious things going on under the surface of the water right now and on the surface if you've looked at the Secretary of Defense's plans for the Navy. So big areas, the school's been a player in those for a long time. Building on that, Cruiser funds and supports the Advanced Robotics Systems Engineering Laboratory, or Arsenal. And it was Arsenal that in 2017 in the skies over Camp Roberts flies off that first dogfight with the GTRI algorithms flying against the Naval Postgraduate School algorithms that Paul talks about in his book. I love reading that section of the book, Paul. I remember being there with you watching that happen. It was a great day. And I have a coin for you if we didn't give you one. A great event. But before that, in 2015, we showed that you could fly swarms of 50 autonomous systems. And just as Paul described, the operator pushes a button and waits unless an alarm comes on, pretty much just sits there. And the machines figure it all out between each other. And these are simple algorithms. You can think of it almost like a swarm of bees or ants, where primitive behaviors add up to complex results. Exciting work, and our students and faculty get to be right in the middle of it. And we love doing it, and we combine with the best and leaders of industry to do those kind of things. Follow on again, come another year, 2018, we kind of broke out of what would be homogeneous swarming. You know, when Paul described it, the red and the blue were both the same vehicle, just different algorithms. Well, in 2018, we moved on to multi-domain. So underwater, surface water, aerial vehicles, all at the same time. And we did that multi-domain, heterogeneous, different types of platforms with different command algorithms controlled by a central network control system. We called this the multi-thread experiment. So in the waters on and around San Clemente Island down off Southern California, NPS CFOX vehicles, for the first time ever, autonomously deliver a SEAL team to the island that carries out a simulated attack using small drones. Those drones and the attack force are supported by surveillance aircraft, which include NPS Scan Eagle aircraft in the skies overhead, underwater NPS Remus vehicles, and those CFOX vehicles, after delivering the team, go out to perform a network relay mode. They were all connected to an NPS student that happened to be on a destroyer operated by 3rd Fleet off the coast, providing the commander awareness of that operation. What was really unique is all of those vehicles moved and positioned themselves to support that SEAL team without any humans telling them what to do. The network control system coordinated the different types of platforms in different areas within enough constraints that a commander could be comfortable letting them be autonomous, if you will, right? So one of the things I love about Paul's work is he relates it back to the real mission. It's one thing to build a thing that goes and flies by itself. It's another to be able to trust it to fly where you need it, when you need it, and to change that as the circumstance changes. So we are taking those early steps to figure out how do we give a commander enough confidence that the system will do what we think it does, so that they can get the advantage, if you will, of letting an autonomous system operate without a lot of human engagement. So really exciting work. And those are just some examples. All of those programs, Cruiser, CAVAR, Arsenal, all of those acronym groups are still active on campus and still doing great work for us. So I mentioned that this puts NPS students in the middle of these kind of projects along with their faculty members. In addition to that, it keeps NPS connected to the Office of Naval Research, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, civilian industry partners. The entire Naval Research and Development enterprise is able to work with us and through that. And we not only expose the students to the technology, and as Paul points out, the policy challenges and ethical issues that go with those, we're able to embed them, if you will, in the type of thinking that will be necessary to deal with these things as they evolve. So we set them up, we think, for success as we go forward. So that brings us to kind of my latest activity that I'm doing on campus is the Sea Land Air Military Research Initiative. So if we're building these systems and they can operate in multiple domains, and we need students to understand them, so it's wonderful to be able to do that off the coast of San Clemente Island, but that's a long way to go and you miss a lot of class while you're down there. So one of the big leads for Slammer right now is to build a facility that will allow us to do all domain robotics, autonomous systems work in an environment that focuses on the command and control and autonomy as much as it does the physical systems. So short walk from campus, 11 minutes from the building I'm sitting in. We are taking what used to be a water treatment plant and we are repurposing that into a modern robotics facility. We've already brought online one of the aquatic environments and our colleagues are already taking advantage of that to do the type of research that is expensive if you have to take it out into the ocean to do your testing. So we're working hard to create that environment to allow that to happen. There's other emphasis on the project. We are taking the Secretary's call for urgency and action, and we are pushing hard to create new business processes and new ways to work with industry. So any of the folks on the foundation out there that find this exciting and think there's something we should know about, we have a very open RFI. We can have a discussion with anybody about things that might help the government understand this emerging technology or help industry understand the government's problems. So we're standing by to do that as we go along. The Sea Land Air Military Research Initiative website, nps.edu/slammer, SLMR, is available and has a place where people can sign up for more information. And if we don't have the answers, we'll get them connected with other folks on campus that can do that. So that's kind of an overview of some of the work on campus. It's not all exhaustive. There's a lot of good work going on here. We haven't really touched about the policy expectations and the challenges, but here's a few thoughts I'd like to add to Paul's for discussion as we go forward. So from my perspective and working the ethics piece, I don't like the term killer robots, although it works really nice to get press attention. And I say that because AI or robotic systems never choose to kill. That's not the way we design them. It's not how we program them. Killing, choosing to take a life, may be a uniquely human characteristic. Even animals generally eat. You know, that's the purpose behind their actions. And while one can be too rigid in their view, I would offer that this type of warfare may simultaneously be both more lethal and more humane. You know, no AI directed system is going to strafe a pilot in a parachute because his buddy was shot down on the other drone, right? Those kind of actions we don't have to worry about. Another big issue, will these systems make conflict more or less likely? So the Iranians shot down a US drone and we largely ignored it. Would we have done that if there was a pilot in it? If the drone had cost more, would we have cared? Would we have put the drone there if there'd been a pilot in it? There's a whole layer of questions. And the Chinese, by the way, picked up one of our unmanned undersea vehicles and nobody quite knew how to respond to that when it started. And I've heard the question in the Pentagon, is a US flagged unmanned warship sovereign US territory in the same way that a manned US warship is considered sovereign US territory? And we don't have the answers to those. Those kind of questions are out there. We don't know what they're going to look like. I'll toss in one because I know we had a conference last month that people talked about the threat of autonomy in general. And one of the things that I think is interesting is, are the AI weapons, which as Paul mentioned, we designed them with killing and control of killing, if you will, in mind. The machines don't see it as killing, but the humans think about it that way. Are non-weapon systems a bigger threat to humanity than these systems? You know, Google and Facebook are Orwell's version of Big Brother. It might not be the government, but they do control enormous amounts of things that are going on. And are we, you know, back to the cyber piece Paul discussed, are we thinking about it that way, that broadly? Because these systems aren't easily dissected or separated from military systems or us, the people who are the military system, right? So there's some real challenges there. And I'll just kind of end with, Paul he has a really nice piece for folks that want to hear it on NPR. And Paul gives the example of being out in the field with a group of folks, and an underaged young lady is effectively a scout for the bad guys, and points out that the laws of war said, you know, you can shoot a scout. There's no age limit involved, but it would be wrong. And we sometimes go, okay, substitute the computer. It's legal. It's going to do that. Well, some of my colleagues here at NPS think you can be more nuanced than that, but I would offer that if Paul and his team weren't there and they were robots, that would also change the equation. So the law of war might not be read the same way. The law of war may have to change when our combatants are no longer all human. And how we're going to deal with that, I mean, you could think of it, do we put a big sign like human on board so that the system knows which laws of war to follow? There's a lot of neat challenges coming, but I'll shut up there and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Ray, thank you so much. You gave us a ton to think about. I want to ask a quick follow-up question. In your work, you talked about engaging with small companies that are pioneering emerging technologies, as well as some of the larger and more established defense companies. How do you prioritize your work with these companies in supporting the student experience at NPS?
So I'll answer that a couple of ways, actually. So obviously the Navy and the Department of Defense have priorities that we're aware of. If there are places that we think we can contribute, then we want to contribute there. But one of the mistakes I would argue of any large bureaucracy is assuming that its priorities are the only ones that should be their priorities, because those priorities incorporate what they think the budget's going to be, whether this group's going to get it or that, a whole lot of things that have nothing to do with direct value to the warfighter. They're all worthwhile, but maybe not the most worthwhile. So we like to look at two other sources. One is we have a vehicle by which industry can exchange information with us and propose solutions that folks might not have heard of. And we don't care if that's Lockheed Martin or Green Tech Ag, a little company from Massachusetts that started out developing drones for agricultural purposes and now has 3 or 4 military contracts that they're working on, right? We like to go in both directions. The other piece are students. I have never, as a professor, I've done thesis advisement for over 150 students. I have never not supported a student who was passionate about an idea that they thought was worth exploring, defending, and writing that thesis on. And if it's a good idea, then we work with them to get them into the right places. So one of our recent graduates, I guess about 3 years ago, sent me a note that he got from a warrant officer working for the Commandant of the Marine Corps, who said to him, "Major, just wanted to let you know, we're using your thesis every day here in support of the Commandant." And he sent that note back to me because when he asked for a thesis advisor, what he wanted to do was against US policy at the time. So everyone he talked to said, "Don't waste your time on that." And I said, well, of course it's against US policy if no one's ever made an argument of why that policy should change. So here at NPS, one of the magical things we can do is we can take these mid-grade military officers whose thesis isn't on the list of approved topics from higher up, and we can support that intuition and make them make the argument. Maybe it goes nowhere, but they learn all the same skills and we get to explore a potential, game changer.
Well, again, fantastic. Thank you so much for your comments, Ray. I now want to turn one of the questions that we have from the audience for Paul. And I also want to encourage those that are on on the webinar to put your questions in the chat, and we'll bring those up as we get to them. But Paul, we have a question from John Cephalou. He says, as you discussed in your recent interview with Lucas Perry, an emerging threat in the future will be the self-evolving computer viruses, which could escape human control and wreak havoc on the world at large, mutating through AI and the evolutionary algorithms in order to evade human attempts at containment. There's already a precedent for computer viruses escaping containment due to human carelessness. Is this threat on the Pentagon's radar, and what are they doing about it?
Yeah, thanks. It's a great question. Let me try to ground what I'm talking about there in reality, because it sounds a little wild out and crazy the way the quote is from that podcast. So, first of all, it's worth acknowledging that cyber systems already have a tremendous amount of automation baked into them because of the nature of them being in the computer environment. And in particular, offensive malware, has a lot of automation. In particular, not just in automated spreading across networks in the case of worms, but also automated self-replication, which is kind of an interesting phenomenon that doesn't translate well to the physical domain. So you can have autonomous physical systems. A drone flies around somewhere. It's not going to be spawning other drones, at least not yet, thankfully. That'd be a whole other problem. So, but that's the case. And if you go back to even the very first internet worm, that problem of self-replication and self-propagation across the network gummed up the internet time back in the 80s. So that's a real challenge today. Now, there are a couple things that are automated today, but I think you could see some of these things start to changing on the horizon. One of them is that at present, the bugs that malware exploits are automated. Now, what's interesting is DARPA's Cyber Grant Challenge, which is now 4 years old, basically proved the technology to change that. Didn't use machine learning, used very simple forms of automation to build what's basically, you can think of as like a skeleton key. So if, a normal exploit in a piece of computer software, a 0-day is like a way to pick a lock to get into someplace. What the DARPA teams had built was basically a skeleton key to go in and pick any lock or pick a whole lot of locks and find vulnerabilities. That technology is out on the web. It's on GitHub. You can download it. And so that technology is now several years old, and that's poses some interesting challenges for thinking about future forms of malware that might have the ability to exploit a wider attack surface of systems, particularly as we see billions of Internet of Things devices being put out into the world, which are very, very insecure. And so they have a lot of insecurities, and it may not be at a personal level that big of a deal if somebody hacks your DVR, but we've seen, of course, them leverage for botnets and DDoS attacks and other things. It can be very, very disruptive. So I think that's one whole set of challenges. It's so much grounded in technology today that when I talk to cybersecurity experts, they are deeply concerned about. And they've noted that like Japan did the run to the Olympics, basically just like the government went in and just like hacked people's devices to clean up these cyber vulnerabilities automatically. Because these tools are totally dual use. You can have automatic exploits or automatic bug patching, right? Once you find the bug, you can either exploit it or you can patch it. So that's, I think, like one set of challenges. And then I think there's kind of like, when you start envisioning where this might be going over the long term, there's a broader set of things on a longer time horizon that, the cyber world is evolving so much. It's hard to, I would not hazard a guess as to what time frame we would see these things on. But let me just point out some of the things we're seeing in like cutting edge machine learning systems today. If you look at OpenAI's GPT-3 system, it's a natural language processing model that an AI research company called OpenAI built. It doesn't necessarily have a lot of practical real use applications today. It's a research project, but basically they took like a pretty significant fraction of the internet, downloaded it, text on the internet, and then fed it through a massive neural network using a tremendous amount of computing power. And there was a comment in the chat function about the increase in computing power. 100% agree. And I'll drop a link after I'm talking here into the chat to something that really demonstrates some of these trends in computer processing power, which are just phenomenal growth trends. And what they found was they could generate an AI system that generates text that's totally believable, that fools people. Now, it doesn't mean that the text is truthful, just the same way that like what people say is not necessarily truthful, right? Like, and particularly if your data set is the internet, like then people criticize it afterwards and they were like, well, it's saying false statements. I'm like, no, like, okay, it's based on the data it's using, right? Which is like, people say a lot of crazy stuff on the internet, but it's very believable. You could read the text from it, and it's totally something you could read in like a Reddit thread, right? Some of it's quite clever, actually. Some of it's quite creative. Some of it's nonsense, but it's kind of a mixed bag. But so let's imagine this kind of tool or technique applied to something like computer malware in the future, right? So could you take a large data set, and these machine learning tools generally rely on very large data sets, but let's say you had a very large data set of malware and you fed it into a neural network. And then you said, like, come up with new concepts of malware. That's plausible, right? Are we going to see that tomorrow? I think probably not. Are we going to see that over the next decade? I would say probably yes, right? In some form. We're going to find automated tools that maybe use some of these new techniques in novel ways. So I think like those pose interesting challenges. And I think that as we see more intelligent and adaptive and autonomous systems in other domains, we're going to see them in the cyber domain as well. And I think that the cyber domain poses unique problems because of the deep insecurity of cyber systems as a whole, and then the potential for self-replication and spread and resource acquisition. It's just not the case in the physical domain for robots. It is for computer viruses, right? For physical biological viruses, right? We're living in the middle of a pandemic precisely because biological viruses can self-replicate and can adapt, right? And so computer viruses can do some of those things. And as we begin to see some that are more adaptive over time, I think it raises some novel challenges. Absolutely.
Thanks, Paul. And I'm going to bring in Ray into the conversation here because I loved what you were talking about in the cyber domain. I want to move it now to the more physical domain. The recent conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh between the Armenians and the Azeris has really highlighted that, you know, drones and unmanned systems are going to play an ever larger role in our future conflicts. What lessons should we be learning from the initial engagements of this conflict? Ray, why don't you start, and then we'll ask Paul to finish up. You're on mute, Ray.
How about hovering right over the button? This is where it's kind of bad to be the academic, because my answer, of course, is we need to look at all this carefully and understand it. Both sides are already acting to exploit the outcome with different information themes that they're trying to propose. What is undoubtedly true is that the presence of small, cheap sensors all over the battle space is changing things. And this wasn't the first instance. It kind of bubbled up to the top just due to the scale of losses associated with the battle, and armor being vulnerable. So the armor appears to have been vulnerable. Yes to better sensing. Yes to better targeting. Yes to poor training. Yes to not good operation. You know, there's a lot of reasons that went into this, in addition to the presence of these drones. But we've seen the drones used against the Russians in Syria. The Saudi Arabians have been victimized by them. They're all over the third world conflicts that folks that are Paul's former comrades who are out there in small countries where they didn't really have a counter ISR worry, now have to worry about small systems that can be operated anywhere on the planet by almost anyone, that have very good positioning information, very good imagery. This problem is a huge one. And one of the big issues is cost, right? If I can put 1,000 things that cost $1,000 on the battlefield, and everything that shoots one down costs me $1 million, even the United States can't handle that kind of offset very long, right? So I think this is going to continue to be an issue. What to me is most interesting, again, as an academic, is we need to be thinking about what this shows us is what should the tactics be employing these type of systems, as Paul mentioned, in conjunction with the human operators to achieve the mission. And the way that happens for us is that's going to be a lot of time on training ranges, a lot of time. And we have not done that I would suggest we have not done that to the degree that we need to often enough. I think it's starting to change. I think people are realizing it, and we're going to get there. But we kind of haven't gone all in yet. And I think our opponents, through cost reasons, are. So.
Awesome. Thanks. Paul?
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, I think it's really critical to like follow these issues closely and try to learn the lessons we can. It's always best to learn the lessons from the wars that other people are fighting and the mistakes that they're making, right? When you can. And I'll be interested to see, I think that, you know, the conventional wisdom of lessons coming out of this conflict will evolve over time as we see both the conflict evolving and then people have more opportunity to like do some really deep analysis and interviews. So like, I will eagerly await a lot of those reports that I think we'll see US and other analysts put out. I think as a first blush, let me make a couple observations. One is I've been watching the real-time debate like with a lot of interest. And what I think is interesting is that people tend to come to these things with sort of one of two lenses, both of which have very, very a lot of legitimacy. One is that everything is old is new, or everything new is old, and like, you know, nothing changes in war, and war has these sort of fundamental truths. And like, totally, that's true, and that's on display, right? And so, you know, if that's the frame you're looking at it, you look at this and you're like, you know, there's obvious lessons about combined arms warfare and the importance of training and professionalism and like, you know, the lethality of war, like people die, shit gets blown up, like that's all true, right? So like, I think no disputes there. I think there's also, you know, one of the challenges in thinking about warfare is that war is constantly, while there are these constancies that exist throughout war, the methods of warfare are also always evolving and changing based on the particular conflict, based on technology, based on tactics and doctrine. And its value in trying to understand what is new, even if the thing that's new is incremental, because that may be the thing that kills you, right? And I think you don't want to lose sight of both. You know, one of the things that I look at, a couple of things, which I don't think are actually a shocker to those who've been following drones closely, but I think are on display. I think we've seen this prior to Nagorno-Karabakh, but they're on display here. One is the use of drones for propaganda purposes. That's very different from artillery, right? Even if you were wiping out these same tanks with artillery, you don't get the video, right? And the video is being used by the militaries in these, you know, really proactive kind of social media and other campaigns. So that's one. The other one is that drones lower the bar for air power. And so because of these cost issues that Ray was talking about, like, you know, a lot of the response I've heard to people is like, well, this is just about air power. Yeah, and now it's cheaper and it's easier to get into the game, right? And so you don't need an F-16, you don't need to train a pilot. Like, it's much easier to execute air power. And that's, of course, something that, you know, as Ray talked about, we've been on the flip side of in this Iraq and Syria with threats from small state groups and small drones. But I think what we're seeing here is like a little bit higher level of capability in drones and more lethality. I think it also shows the diminishing value of armor for protection. So what do I mean by that? I don't actually mean armor in the sense of tanks, like a mobile, you know, gun on the battlefield. There's probably still value in that. But I mean like physically slapping armor on the side of a vehicle for protection. It's really, I think we've reached the apex of that with the current generation of tanks. You've got like it was like 90 tons. And, you know, particularly from top attack threats, whether it's from drones or just top attack missiles like a Javelin, you really cannot armor these systems effectively. And so I think people in the armor world, you know, totally understand this, have shifted their thinking to thinking about the survivability onion, layering on protection with active protection systems, increased camouflage and deception and decoys. I think we see that on display of like the way that we protect ground vehicles and armored ground vehicles and survivability will rely increasingly on things that are not actual, you know, armor. And I'll just point out that that's already the case in other domains. That's not how we protect aircraft and ships, right? We protect them with more active measures, with stealth, with decoys, with active protections to intercept systems. We're not layering on extra armor necessarily to be the thing that protects you. And I think that's going to be the case for ground vehicles as well. That doesn't mean that I would suggest we get rid of all armor today, but I think increasingly we'll see over the next several decades protection shifting into those other domains. And it is quite possible that a while from now, several decades from now, we cross into an era where people just give up actually on like direct physical armor as a means of protection, and they go back to maybe lighter skinned vehicles. And we've seen that in other times in the past where knights sort of shed armor because it's no longer effective, and it's not worth the cost benefit trade-off of weighing you down and sapping mobility.
No, that's fantastic. Thank you for that conversation. I'm going to go to the chat. We've got a great question from Christina Gatti, and she actually reflects some of the same issues that Thomas Cavero brings up, but she does it from the perspective of her role as a department head and a tactical action officer. She says, as a tactical action officer on board a destroyer, how do I rely on my weapon and combat systems to protect the ship and our sailors while still assuring my captain that it will not inadvertently shoot a missile at a friend, or worse, starting a conflict against our adversaries because the system saw the contact as a threat? Paul, why don't you start, and then we'll turn it over to Ray.
Yeah, I don't think there's actually an easy answer to that. I think that's one of the crux of the dilemmas of these systems today. I will say, I talk about in the book, I had a chance to go down to the Aegis Training Center in Dolgan, Virginia, and was just really, really incredibly impressed by the, no surprise, I think anybody here on the call, but just incredibly impressed by the professionalism, of course, of the naval officers in the school there. But also, what I was struck by was a tremendous amount of respect for the Aegis combat system and the use of automation there. That it was certainly not sort of cavalier, right? And that even in the training, they sort of give me a demo, which I kind of talk about in detail in the book, but I think many people in the call probably have personal familiarity with, right? They walk through a demonstration of sort of in a testing environment or a training environment, how they would use it on different methods, or different modes of operation, all the way up to auto special. And I was amazed by watching these surface warfare officers walk through this in a training environment. Even in a simulated shot on auto special, they've got an officer standing there with their hand right on the fist key, ready to turn it to disable the system if something goes wrong. And so I think the fact that, I don't think there are easy answers to that question. I think the fact that, tactical action officers are thinking about that is the right mindset, because the answer is going to be that is a risk, right? And there are smart ways to mitigate those risks, to test systems, to do things like once you get into an operating environment, with the system deactivated, they explained how with the system deactivated, they would activate Aegis Doctrine to see how it reacted to the environment. That's great in a peacetime context, but there's always going to be a risk that you get a situation where there's a wartime or crisis situation. That's something you didn't encounter in peacetime, and that surprises folks, right? And that's going to be a challenge. And so I think that healthy amount of respect is the right attitude to take. And I think that there is going to be a continued role for human judgment and that human tactical action officer who's there ready to make that call. And I think it's important to maintain human involvement in those ways.
Outstanding. Thanks, Paul. Ray?
So I'm kind of in violent agreement with Paul, but let me offer this. So the school's very involved with the Navy Research and Development Enterprise and things that are going on now as they're starting to figure out how do we deal with increasingly autonomous systems. And one of the challenges is if you actually start to make them artificially intelligent and give them variability, we get to a space where we can't prove all actions. So I think as the Aegis does, there will always be an off switch. I think that's important. Training becomes really important as to when you do and do not engage that. And the nature of the crisis and the preparation and the context means the same variables might mean I turn it off at one time and I don't turn it off another based on the risk, the threat. If Taiwan is under attack and the Navy's right next door and Chinese missile shooters are everywhere, I might be more biased towards leaving it on, even if there might be fratricide. Where in other environments, absolutely, if I'm not 100% sure, I turn it off. I think if we do it right, the tactical action officer on the ship will make those decisions with those kind of context, because the engineering teams that provide those systems, when the Navy actually deploys them in a warrior capacity, those systems will have the same, it's not that you trust any individual system, you're trusting the system that provided it to you, the certification process the ship goes through, the training of the officers, all of that together, and the enlisted people who maintain it, because if you don't maintain these things, you lose those, right? So it's a huge complex thing when it comes to the weapon systems. And I think by the time the systems are hitting the fleet, which some early ones are, we'll have at least good initial set of technology, training, and tactics to start fine tuning to get to the place where we'll need to be if we find ourselves in a peer competitor kind of competition.
Boy, fantastic. Thank you so much for that. We got another question from Scott Hummer for both of you. His question is, do you see military education needing to change with more humans in, on, or out of the loop who may find themselves controlling swarms or robots at the tactical level? And if there is a need for change, in what way? Ray, why don't you start as the guy at NPS, and then we'll turn it over to Paul.
So I think one of the biggest things that's changing and has to change. So we're talking about how fast the machines are. And if we're still trying to control them with a rigid chain of command hierarchy, it doesn't matter how fast the machines are. We remain the vulnerability in the loop. So there's been, the language has changed, I think, across the services to pushing more authority and command capability. The force has to become more educated and has to be more trusted. And I think that's for humans to interact on a battlefield in real time, what we need is that human element in close context with the problem that's going to direct those autonomous systems. It can't go back to the COCOM commander or the fleet commander or the XYZ commander. So the education, the ability to deal, I think we started off talking about uncertainty, the ability to deal with uncertainty, which education is how we prepare people for uncertainty, I think is more important and will be more important than it has been in warfare in the past.
Thanks, Ray. Paul?
Yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of things that have to change as we figure out how to use more autonomous systems in swarming. I don't know all of them, but I want to highlight two examples that have been raised to me that I think are interesting examples of the kinds of ways that we'll have to change how we think about some of these systems. One comes from when I was visiting NPS and talking to some of their folks doing modeling and simulation for swarms. And one of the NPS researchers said to me, he said, what is the, what are the commands you give a swarm, right? So if you can imagine, certain military units today, you might tell them to advance, to flank, to do something else, right? Like for a swarm, what does that look like, right? Is it to disperse? Is it to coalesce? Is it to encircle? Like what are those, the whole point of a swarm is that the human isn't joysticking the individual elements, right? But we also don't want it to just be, the human sort of like, you can imagine interfaces today where the human like circles a bunch of elements and selects them and moves them somewhere else. I think there are probably lessons to be learned from gaming environments for how to think about blended human and machine command and control over large numbers of independent autonomous assets that are not like super smart in a complex system. It doesn't mean that we necessarily use those directly, but like I was just reading today about like a really interesting new computer game that uses swarming tactics. And I think like the point being that's going to change how we think about how you interface an issue. It's ultimately a command and control problem. It's going to change how you think about even like what are those commands that you're giving the swarm, which is an interesting question. I'm not really sure the answer is. The other thing that a naval officer said to me once, that was really interesting, was that we have for things like ROE, we have sort of pre-established concepts that we can issue out very quickly that might help give people information about regulating ROE at different levels. So things like weapons free or weapons tight, right? And different parts of the military might use these terms in different ways or different terminology. Like when I was on the ground as a Ranger, I'd interact with Marines and they would use totally different terminology to mean the same thing. I don't understand what the hell they're talking about, right? And I'm sure vice versa, right? So, but these exist everywhere, right? At different particular jobs. And what this naval officer said was we need something like that for autonomy, right? So that we can issue commands to people quickly to elements of the force and say, look, we're going to move to an autonomous free, right? Or autonomy tight or whatever that means, right? To basically, and then for different aspects of the force, they might understand, all right, listen, the guidance from higher is we're using more or less autonomy and we can dial that up or down in different settings. And that's an interesting concept that I think like is the kind of thing that something like that feels right about how we'll need to adapt for how we employ these systems over time.
Oh, outstanding. And gentlemen, I know that we are at 4 o'clock. I'd like to get to a few more questions if you're willing to stay with us. Is that okay? Perfect. So I want to take a question that Karen Hargrove poses in the chat and expand it a little bit. She says, do offensive cyber weapons make sense given that they can be captured and then turned against us, with Stuxnet being an example? And I want to broaden it out, especially in light of the Navy's construct for additional autonomous systems at sea. So, offensive weapons that might be turned against us. How do we think about that and the risk that that might pose? Paul, why don't you start us off?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I think for cyber systems, the sort of gain, the intel gain loss there is something that absolutely has to be figured in, because they are open source weapons, right? And you can, once we know that people have pulled apart Stuxnet and used it and repurposed its code in different ways. And so that's very different than if your aircraft crashes somewhere else, it's not going to be that easy to necessarily reverse engineer. People are going to work on it. They're going to try, but it's not necessarily going to be as easy as with cyber systems. And meanwhile, you could scale up the cyber systems in a way that's totally impossible with physical systems, right? You have to build a production line even once you reverse engineered it. And I think that poses challenges for other elements of military power as that increasingly moves into software. I think that's also true for things like electronic warfare, for sensors, for autonomy, things that are more digital. There are parts of those that are going to be really hard, engineering, like a radar also has hard electronics engineering in it. That's not just the code, right? Or same thing with sensors. But I think that's true across the board in software-based systems. It's going to have to change over time how we think about, the pros and cons of deploying these systems. I'd say additionally, for things like autonomous systems, we absolutely should be thinking about the risk that they get just hacked and used against us in real time, right? Yes, that should be a factor. That's a major concern. And that should, I don't think that's a reason to say we're not going to use them, but it means I think it should be a consideration for how we think about employing them and the cybersecurity and then things like fail-safe kind of mechanisms, right? How do we ensure that, the worst case scenario here isn't an accident where it shoots the wrong thing. The worst case scenario is someone hacks a fleet of autonomous systems and turns them against us. And that is quite troubling.
Paul, that great comments. Thank you. Ray?
So I'll kind of answer it two ways. One, first, I would hope it's policy that if you develop an offensive cyber capability that targets, we have to talk more specific, but targets something. So we talked about Stuxnet. If you're going to build something that targets a capability that you value, you should also require your team to provide, if you will, the antidote. If you're going to develop the chemical weapon, you should have the antidote, the biological. So I think in cyber, if we're going to develop truly threatening cyber systems that aren't valuable just because they hit at the right time, but because they actually could be an existential threat back to us, then that should be part of your design. And part of the release criteria for that weapon system should be the assumption that somehow it comes back at you. I don't think you can avoid that. That's just the nature of cyberspace. You have to think that way. That is not to say that all of our opponents will think that way. And because of the lowered bar to entry for non-state actors also to play in this space, that actually scares me a lot. People could release things that are very difficult or next to impossible to deal with if we're totally dependent on the software. And I think Paul brought up one of the things that I haven't seen as much as I'd like to have seen, but are seeing bits and pieces. We need the hardware cut out so that you can't just control everything by software. There has to be an independent system that will render the software side of the system inoperative or to a controlled minimum mode. We need that cutout switch, and I think it's doable. But good engineering and good testing will be required to see that happen. To the larger question of all those ships out there in the fleet, we have to assume someone's going to try to do those kind of things. Just like we make sure you cannot reverse engineering certain types of cryptologic communications devices and those things. Now this changes the cost model. They go from being real cheap systems to more expensive systems. But if we're going to make them weapon systems, we need to invest the extra cost to make sure we can always cause a graceful or controlled failure when we need to. And I think that just has to be part of good design.
No, fantastic, Ray. And this question kind of builds on some of the points that you were making. But Derek Phillips, again, asked a great question. He says, some of our allies buy weapons from our adversaries. How do we train autonomous systems to adjust to that possibility? i.e., we're in coalition with people that have adversary systems alongside our own. Ray, why don't you give that a shot up front?
So here, instead of engineering, since we don't get to control that, we have to have policy and processes that help us deal with that. And it could be the old-fashioned thing that you just can't use certain things in close proximity to others, which there's a long history in warfare of coalitions basically dividing the battlefield into lanes. So we might have to go back to primitive techniques like that. I will say that it can often be a very good thing that our allies buy systems from our adversaries. We could learn good things that way.
Absolutely. Paul?
Yeah, I mean, I think it speaks to probably the importance of maintaining flexibility in how we employ systems. And so having systems where the autonomy doctrine, if you will, is highly customizable and not like baked in, so that you can adjust it to the context. The context might be that like not always killing T-72s is the right answer. It might depend on the scenario. And I think that giving the warfighter those tools so that they can customize the actual employment of the thing is a much better approach than one where those things are like sort of hard coded in based on engineering ahead of time. You want to retain that flexibility in the hands of the user.
No, thank you. And we're going to go to a slightly different question, but one that was discussed earlier. And partly it's based on the Secretary of Defense looking at force design for 2045, calling for a 500 ship Navy with a mix of manned and unmanned systems, and really thinking about how autonomy might be considered in the force design discussions. But Colonel Randy Pugh asked the question, with that, what are the implications for how we need to recruit and retain personnel? So talent acquisition and retention are not just about talent development and talent management. So how do we understand the talent question? Paul?
One of the things, I think for what it's worth, I think that the Navy and Air Force in particular are like in a better place than necessarily the Army on this, and that they're just more technically oriented services writ large, I think, which is advantageous here. But one of the consistent concerns I hear from folks is that on like software, we really struggle as a department, and that we both struggle to build software effectively, to build software with the right kinds of vendors that are software companies, rather than it was not always defense primes, to recruit the right kinds of talent in a variety of ways and get access to the right kind of software talent, but also to harness talent within our own ranks. And this is something I continually hear, is that we've actually got soldiers and sailors and airmen and marine who have expertise and experience coding, and yet we're not necessarily using them and employing them in the right way. I don't know if this is still around, but the Navy had created this a couple of years ago, this commanders, the CRIC, the sort of group of like junior officers, right? I don't know if it's still around or not, but I had the opportunity to be part of a sort of expanded group of that a few years ago. It was like basically an email channel called the CRIC Actually, they were kind of expanded. And I remember this debate going around the group where this young sailor reached out and said, hey, want to crowdsource some ideas, want some feedback from the group, part of a team looking at like next gen submarine. What should be the capabilities of the submarine? And all these sailors piled in with these brilliant ideas saying, look, maybe it's not a submarine at all. Maybe that's not the right way to think about, dominance in the undersea domain. Maybe it's this distributed swarm of undersea vehicles and payload modules and da-da-da. And he was like, yeah. I'm totally with you, but I've been told what's the next submarine going to be and what should the requirements be? And like that, so part of what is, how do we just unleash the creativity that exists in our force and get the bureaucracy out of the way? Because I think we have the talent. We actually have it. We just need to empower people.
No, thanks, Paul. Ray?
So I'm going to go pretty much the same direction. And unfortunately, I'm not real optimistic. The CNO's Rapid Innovation Cell was the CRIC that Paul was referring to. It like a variety of other attempts to create some energy and buzz around the end have limited success. The problem typically is when you take those people that you've taken the blinders off, you've let them accelerate, and then you put them back in a system that values compliance to checklist and 40,000 things that are not the cool professional things you do as a naval officer or an Army soldier or a Marine. We have to reduce drag. Use the flight metaphor. Yeah, it's great to try to add a little more power to the engines, but I'll get much more flight time if I reduce drag on the system. When I start seeing IGs come out and their job is to determine which commands have recommended the most reduction in rules and instructions that are overlapping, not beneficial, aren't timely, no longer apply, then I'll believe the Navy's serious or the Department of Defense is serious. Right now, they come out and here's a checklist, and it's not even just the rules, it's how we think you should think about the rules. And every year, that gets longer. So you bring in bright, talented people, even if you take your current leaders, like the CRIC had, really bright officers and enlisted people in that activity. And then you send them back to a world where nobody, hey, if you're not following the checklist, we don't care. Folks are more afraid of the IG and the lawyers than they are of the Chinese or the Russians. And to me, that's disheartening. I will say, though, as Paul pointed out, there are many bright young Americans, men and women, that have those good ideas and want to engage. And it's our job, and we try to do this to some degree here at NPS, to give them space, to give them a chance to go out there and do that. And for these areas, the folks we're competing for will be able to make more money and probably work with less bureaucracy. What we hold are cool problem sets, challenges they can't get in the civilian world. And we got to shift the balance so that that keeps them with us instead of chasing other commodities that are of value.
Ray, I'm going to let that be the last word on that. That was fantastic. And this has just been an incredible discussion today. I'll also say that we had a question by Shane Robinette, and he was asking about changing the mentality on accountability to truly harness the benefits of equipment that's supposed to be disposable, but because they're on the commander's equipment report, there's a mindset that they need to be recovered. But I think you covered that in that mindset that it's about the mission, not about, the compliance regime that is required to get there. And if we unleash the talents of the folks that we already have and truly value them in those special ways, we'll be able to accomplish the missions that our nation has asked for us to achieve. So, yeah, gentlemen, thank you. Go ahead, Ray.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I just want to make sure it's clear. I am not saying that rules and professionalism and all those great things are not important or required. The system just doesn't ever go back and clean out the deadwood, if you will. Professionalism, as Paul's pointed out, these are complicated issues. They're going to take a thinking human with full context and understanding of what's going on to make this work the way it needs to work. So people have to get better, and we have to find a way to keep those bright, talented people. That's why I'm passionate about the subject, not because I don't think it's important that we have that professionalism and the compliance in the areas that it needs to be there. So.
No, absolutely. And again, thank you so much, gentlemen, for a really vibrant discussion today. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rich Patterson to take us out.
Thanks very much, Todd. And thank you, Paul and Ray, for this great discussion. I hope everybody has enjoyed this. Thank you to Todd for moderating. And the last topic around the human being in all of this, we'd like to alert you to our next presentation on November 12th at 3 p.m. Pacific time. NPS Alumni Association Foundation will feature 4 special operations officers who will share their personal perspective and stories on the topic of the human side of special forces or special operations. This event will further highlight the importance of the work the Human Enhancement Research Group is doing here at NPS to repair, develop, and conduct research on the physical and cognitive abilities of the students that come here. We encourage you to attend and gain unique insight into this world, into the world of and lives of people who serve in some of the most consequential locations around the globe. We hope to see you then, and thanks for tuning in.